class. I just want to go ahead and give you some information over Unit 2. So I hope everything's going great with all of you guys. What I'm talking about today, you can find on page 234, starting on page 234 of your textbook. You might also want to pull out this. These are the notes that I've posted for you on Google Classroom. And as we go through, you'll find the answers to these. Here we go. So I know we've talked about it before, but I just want to recap. This is very important that you understand this because so much of the Renaissance movement is a clap back, an anger that people felt because the church was so wealthy and so powerful. And we see that already start brewing in Canterbury Tales. Of course, we see there's rampant corruption in the church, and people are sick of it. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church was the dominant world power. You need to understand that it was more powerful than any one government. The church was, and because of that, it was increasingly elaborate, increasingly wealthy. Really, there is just one church until 1054. In 1054, there is a moment that's called the Great Schism. And this is a turning point in human history because at this point, the church splits for the first time. It splits into the Catholic Church and into the Greek Orthodox Church, which still exists today. And this was the first time that people really realized, hey, maybe the church isn't perfect. Maybe we could question it. And so that little bit of idea that you could question the church continued on in people's mind, but it really wasn't solidified until later. And you can see here, this is just some Christian history, church history that you may or may not be interested in. This is, if you look at from the time of Christ, starting with John the Baptist, these are the major councils where significant things took place. And you can see a lot of the Gnosticism, Arianism, Old Believers, Iconoclasm, Anglicanism, a lot of things that still exist today. These are not new ideas. These are ideas that have existed for a very long time. And the church was trying to deal with all of these throughout human history. And you can see here these little symbols that I've given you. Over here on the far left is the Greek Orthodox symbol. In the middle is the Presbyterian symbol, and over here on the far right is, of course, the Catholic Church symbol, and that makes sense because it has the little Pope hat. Now this is where you might be a little bit more interested. See, after the church split again during the Reformation, and of course we're going to talk about that a lot during this unit because that's such a central idea and central part of this unit. Once the church splits, that's the second time the church split, and the church continues to split and continues to split and continues to split. And every time it splits, it dilutes the power and it reduces the wealth of the church so that we could now, in our modern world, have a true separation of church and state. See, during the late 1500s, 1600s, that would have been impossible, which is part of the reason why England does not have separation of church and state. The Queen is, of course, the monarchy, the head monarchy, but she is also the head of the Anglican Church, even still today. There's not a separation between the two. And you can see here kind of where, if you are a Christian, where you might fall, and where the roots of your movement might have begun. You can see here Lutheranism, that was born, of course, because of Martin Luther. Anglicanism is, of course, the church that was founded by Henry VIII. And from Anglicanism, we have Methodism, which is Methodist Church, that was born out of that. And then you have also the early Calvinist movement that was happening around the same time of the Reformation. And out of that Calvinist movement, we now have, of course, the Baptist churches and Presbyterian churches. You may not realize, but the Holiness movement, the Pentecostal churches, those are relatively young movements. Those didn't start, you see, until the 1900s. So you can see in here with the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, Third Great Awakening, and we are now currently living in what is considered the Fourth Great Awakening. So it's kind of interesting where all of this is coming from, and how every time the church is split, you have these new groups of people who go out and do different things in the world. Now, with that in mind, and this is a fun little song by Gwen Stefani that I love. You can watch it if you want to. You can skip it if you want. It's really just some background information about the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague is pretty significant in human history. Without it, as terrible as it was, we would not be the civilization that we are today. It started in 1347, and with it, 1/3 of the entire European population died, which is a staggering number of people. Entire villages, entire cities were decimated, burned to the ground because of the bubonic plague. It was a terrible, terrible time, but what was good that came out of it was it effectively ended the Middle Ages, because people started to who were part of the lower class, that the villeins, the peasant class, they started requiring higher wages for their work. And so this then ended feudalism. It also greatly impacted the church, because the church wasn't ready for the kind of questions that people asked, which were like, if there is a God, if there's a good God, how could he allow something like this terrible plague to kill 1/3 of our population? And so people really, for the first time in England, well, for the first time since they had been introduced to Christianity, they stopped going to church, and we have this larger and larger group growing, and we'll see that then come to its largest point once we get to the modern and postmodern age. But people begin to start doubting God. They start doubting the church. And so that's maybe part of what led to the church splits that happened during this time. This is a picture of a plague doctor. And you can see by looking at him that it's a ridiculous outfit. The leather hat and the glass eye and the mask that was stuffed full of herbs, spices. It's a terrible thing that they wore, but it really did work. The doctors who wore these outfits, they didn't die. And of course, we, with our modern knowledge, when we look at it, we realize, oh, the reason he didn't die is because the fleas couldn't bite him. And so that's the reason why they lived. And of course, I think we've talked about in all the classes about how you are already aware of some facts about the Black Plague, about how you would get circles on your cheeks, and then 24 hours later, you would die. It was a terrible way to die. And of course, that's where we have the children's song, Ring Around the Rosie. And whenever you see children play that, what they're really playing is they're reenacting the Black Death. So if you look over here on the right, you can see a marker that tells us the exact port that the Black Death came through. It killed at least 30%. Some historians believe that as much as 50% of England died during this time. The picture at the bottom, this is a picture of a modern man who does have bubonic plague, and he is a severe case towards the end stages. Of course, he's going to be fine, because once you treat bubonic plague with antibiotics, you can recover. But we know that he's in the last stages because his hands have turned black already. And that was the reason why I got the name, the Black Death. Now, some names and terms that you need to know. You need to know about Copernicus. Copernicus is a Polish astronomer. He is one of the first to propose and theorize that the Earth moved around the sun. This doesn't seem like it's very groundbreaking to us, but during this time, it's a very groundbreaking idea. You also have Henry VIII, who was the second Tudor king. Henry VII was the beginning of the Tudor line. Henry VIII is the beginning of, or excuse me, the second Tudor king who establishes the Anglican Church. An armada is a fleet of ships. The Spanish Armada tried to invade England. They ultimately failed. And of course, part of the reason why they failed is possibly because Queen Elizabeth gave such a moving speech at the port at Tilbury. And I want you to watch that today. Make sure you watch that speech and read it out of your textbook. Now, Elizabeth I, you've probably heard of her before. She's considered the greatest of all the queens, the greatest of all the monarchs, really. Although Elizabeth II, the current Queen Elizabeth, some historians believe that she's given Queen Elizabeth I quite a run for her money. But Elizabeth I was a daughter of Henry VIII. James I was the first Stuart king. He's the beginning of the Stuart line. He is the one that Queen Elizabeth named as her successor because she didn't have any children. Now, Martin Luther, you can see him right over here on the far right. He was the German theologian who really began the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance was really earlier than the English Renaissance. Like so many things in human history, people are inspired by one another. And so we have the Italian Renaissance, where you have the birth of culture and renewed interest in the classics. And you have painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo who are creating their masterpieces during this time. Well, as those ideas begin to travel north into England, we have the English Renaissance. And during the English Renaissance, even though it's coming a little later than the Italian Renaissance, it's a moment in English history where England is growing more powerful. It is incorporating itself into the European world. It's not seen as sort of a backward little country anymore, but instead seen as a major world power, which is a pretty significant shift. We see that the views around the world are changing. People are no longer just blindly believing everything that they are told. And we especially see this rise of humanism. Now, humanism is an interest in how the past can help the future. It's the reason why we study history, because we can learn from things that have happened. That's humanism. Now, there really hadn't been that idea up until the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, we see how people are moving away from teachings of the church and instead moving forward and saying, hey, we could learn from what people have done before us. And so we see society starting to evolve, become a little bit more secular during this Renaissance, this rebirth period. Now, the Protestant Reformation created so much conflict in Europe, and that is not true anywhere as much as it was in England. Protestants and Catholics fought each other. There were monarchs on both sides. There was a lot of bloodshed over whether the country was going to be Protestant or whether the country was going to be Catholic. And that seems like a silly thing to us to fight over, because we live in the US where we have freedom of religion. But many countries still don't have that freedom. And even in Ireland, even still today, the Catholics and the Protestants hate one another, which is foreign to us, but it's something that still occurs. Now, England became Protestant whenever Henry VIII was refused permission from the Pope. The Pope is, of course, Catholic. He was refused permission to divorce. He wanted to divorce his wife. The Catholic Pope said, nope, you cannot. Now, it may be that part of the reason why he wouldn't allow the divorce was because the woman that King Henry VIII was married to was Catherine of Aragon, which was a Spanish princess. Spanish is, of course, very Catholic. And he didn't want to make all of Catherine of Aragon's family angry by allowing a divorce. But Henry VIII, he didn't care that the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. He just said, that's fine, I'll just create my own church. What you need to understand, though, is that the Protestant movement came before Henry VIII decided he was going to create his own church. If there wouldn't have already been a Protestant movement in the works, then Henry VIII wouldn't have thought about how he could possibly create his own church. But there were already Protestants earlier on. Now, a little bit about Henry VIII. Henry VIII, he wanted a son. That's the essential problem because girls were not good enough. He wanted a son. Now, his wife had only produced a girl. This girl was named Mary Tudor. She is often in history referred to as Bloody Mary. Um, and he's married, of course, to this Catholic princess. They're married for a long time, and apparently they had a pretty good marriage. They loved each other. They were happy. They had this daughter, and then she had a series of miscarriages and was not able to have another child. And so Henry VIII, because he was desperate to have a son, and because he and Catherine, were not really getting along so much anymore, Henry VIII started having an affair with a young Protestant woman. Okay, and that Protestant woman, of course, was influencing him to Protestant ideas. Now, this made Catherine of Aragon extremely angry because she was a very devout Catholic. And so it just caused a further rift between them. And so Henry VIII wanted a divorce, wouldn't allow it because the Pope said no. This is, of course, what led to the Church of England, what we refer to now as the Anglican Church. King Henry is responsible for taking Martin Luther, the 95 Thesis, all that stuff. He took it mainstream and created the first legal Protestant church in England. Now, here you can see the wives of Henry VIII. Here at the very front, you can see Catherine of Aragon. And like I said, Spanish princess. They had a pretty healthy marriage from what we understand, at least for the first many years. They were married something like 20 years. I don't remember how long, but a pretty long time. Then the one next to him, this is Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is the Protestant woman that he started having an affair with. Anne Boleyn is the mother of Queen Elizabeth. Okay, now just keep that in mind for a second. Then he had Anne Boleyn beheaded because there was a group of Catholics who didn't like the fact that Anne Boleyn had moved Henry VIII into becoming Protestant. They didn't like Anne. They wanted to try to destroy her. And so they made up a bunch of rumors about her, about how she was having an affair, how she was having an affair with her brother, which is gross, really wasn't happening, but they said that it was. And so Henry VIII, he had her beheaded. Okay, this is Queen Elizabeth's mama. So after she died, Henry VIII rocked along for a little bit. Then he married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was referred to by Henry VIII as his one true love, his true marriage. Okay, Jane Seymour was completely besotted with Henry VIII, and she had a child with him. The child they had together was Edward the Sixth. This child was incredibly sickly from the very word go. We don't know what issues he had as of today, but we do know that he was just not a healthy child. Jane Seymour died in childbirth, okay? And Henry VIII grieved for her for a really long time. But because Edward VI was not particularly healthy, Henry VIII got a lot of pressure from the people around him, his advisors, to choose another bride. And so eventually he said, okay, fine. So the way that they did it back then, like Renaissance Tinder, was they would bring him like portraits of different women from different kingdoms, and he would choose. Well, they brought one from Cleves, which was from the family of Cleves, which they were German, okay, from the German monarchy. And it was a beautiful, beautiful portrait of Anne of Cleves. And so Henry VIII said, hey, I'll marry her. So he agrees to marry her. They do a marriage contract. Henry VIII, by this time, he has injured his leg, and he has just a massive wound in his leg. He has a little hard time getting around. So he sends someone to Germany for him to, by proxy, marry Anne of Cleves. Now, that is crazy to us, but it must be nice to be king and be head of the church, and you can do what you want. So that's what he did. He sent one of his advisors to, by proxy, marry Anne of Cleves. So he had never actually met her in person. Whenever Anne of Cleves made her way into the kingdom, she came in, and he saw her for the first time. He said, she's a mare. I have married a mare, meaning that she was a horse. He said that she had a horse face, and he was not a fan, and she was not pretty to him. So he immediately asked to have the marriage annulled. Anne of Cleves agreed to have the marriage annulled with the understanding that she would be allowed to remain in the Tudor kingdom for the remainder of her life, and that she would be taken care of for the remainder of her life. She didn't want to have to go back to the German aristocracy and be embarrassed. And so King Henry VIII, he agreed. He did provide for her and allowed her to live in the palace until she died. He wrote to her, and they have letters where they consider themselves brother and sister, which is super weird considering that they were married and divorced, but whatever. And so on the rebound from that, we have Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine Howard was like 15 whenever she met Henry VIII. Henry VIII was already getting up there. He was already getting pretty old whenever he married Catherine Howard. So we have sort of a weird pedophile thing going on anyway. She was not really in love with him, further than the word goes. She wanted power. That's all she was really concerned about. There's some evidence that suggests maybe that she only married him because her parents made her or forced her to. So she marries this man that she's disgusted by, basically. And they rock along for a year or two. And she begins having affairs, like a lot of affairs. And she's found out, and Henry VIII has her also beheaded. It is then that he marries Catherine Parr. Now, Catherine Parr and him did not have what we would think of as like a traditional marriage. She was more like a nursemaid to him, because this is towards the very end of his life, and she outlived him. Okay. And of all of the marriages he had, which he had 6 marriages, of the 6 marriages he only had 3 children. And that's Mary the First, Elizabeth I, and Edward VI. Now, because of how he favored them, even though they were born in that order, their right to the monarchy, the line of succession, went Edward VI, Mary the First, and then Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth I was the very last one that was able to gain succession of the throne. And it's a little bit ironic. She ended up, of course, being the greatest monarch ever. So you can see here, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, died. And of course, Catherine didn't die, but Henry VIII died. Okay, moving on. Now, Queen Elizabeth's reign is considered the golden age of England, because for the first time England asserts itself as a military power against Spain. The nation was prospering. It was culturally enriched. We have English literature that is blossoming, especially in poetry and drama. And Queen Elizabeth, she really loved the arts, and she invested in the arts. And so that's part of the reason why we consider it a golden age. Now, what is the relationship between place and literature? For this, you need to understand that we begin to think of London as a launching place for the imagination. Elizabethans would come to the theater to be uplifted, to be instructed. The theater during this time was on the very edge of town, and people would go from the very, very poorest to the people who were the nobles, and Queen Elizabeth was also often there. Now, William Shakespeare, he wrote his play Macbeth in order to gain favor with James I, who was Scottish and was like super, super interested in witchcraft. Shakespeare, he rides the line. He was writing during the time of Queen Elizabeth, and then his later stuff was during the time of James I. We see drama and the expansion of London. Plays were staged outside of the city limits, because actors during this time were considered very disreputable. They were not looked upon with great admiration. Women were strictly forbidden from acting in any sort of play, and that's the reason why all the plays were performed by men. Even Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which is, of course, so romantic, would have been performed by two men. One of the men would have dressed up to look like a girl. Often they would use very young men, like 14, 15-year-old boys, to try to get across that idea of this beautiful girl. So dressing in drag, basically. And writers would come to London. Shakespeare was not the only writer in London during this time. We have Ben Jonson, who's writing during this time, and there's just this very strong artistic community that's happening. Something else that's happening is we see um, pastorals become a thing. Now, what a pastoral is it's a poem that celebrates country life. It's a poem about the simple, about the natural life. And English poets would write about this natural life in order to escape from the city. The city of London during this time was a disgusting, smelly, crowded place. And so there was this idealized view of what the countryside was like. And so you'll see that with Sir Walter Raleigh's poem, Come Live With Me and Be My Love. There's this idea of how it's a beautiful, perfect place where everything just works out and everything is perfect. We also see this drastic change in the way that people think about England. There were two big events that launched England into the world stage. The first was the Spanish Armada, and you'll see that with the Tilbury speech. The second was the colonization of the New World. This unit stretches from 1485 to 1625. So you can see the beginning of the colonization that is occurring. It heavily influences the way that the world thinks about England. And by the early 1600s, people are reading English all over the world. It's no longer this little backward place where people don't read English because English is for the commoner, those who don't matter. But it has shifted now to where that people are reading English and enjoying reading things in the English language. Now, literature heavily influence and shapes society. We've talked about that a lot, about how all literature is simply a mirror for what is going on in the world. And one of the things that you need to understand is that is incredibly true here in Unit 2. The literature is reflecting the fact that we see the religious affiliation of England change 4 times in less than 30 years. That's a very significant shift. Okay, so you need to understand everyone is at first Catholic, and that's under Henry VIII, and then it switches because Henry VIII becomes Protestant, and then it switches again because Mary Tudor becomes queen, and she switches everything back to Catholicism, and then Queen Elizabeth becomes queen, and she shifts everything back to Protestantism. Now, that probably gave people whiplash because you're changing back and forth, and Catholicism and Protestantism, even though you have a lot of things in common, you have very different worship styles, and the people who are practicing the wrong one are being persecuted, burned at the stake, hung. And so you have these religious and political loyalties that are constantly changing. Everybody wanted to be practicing the religion that the monarch was. And so as it changed, people were flipping back and forth. It was a lot of just upheaval in religion during this time. Now, Sir Thomas More is a significant figure because Sir Thomas More was one of the very few of the king's advisors who said, or really the only one of the king's advisors who said, you can't start your own church. You can't do it. And you can't have a Church of England. There is one church, the Catholic Church, and you can't start your own church. You're a crazy man. And this, of course, made Henry VIII extremely angry, and he said, off with his head. And Sir Thomas More lost his head. If you look here at the bottom of the slide, you can see this is the actual axe and the place where Sir Thomas More rested his head whenever he lost it. Now, Mary Tudor is right here at the top of the page, and she is often called Bloody Mary. The reason she's referred to as Bloody Mary is because she did change the country back to Catholic. But in her very short reign, she was only queen for 5 years. Um, but during that time, she burned 300 Protestant Christians at the stake. Um, and she also, that doesn't even include all the other terrible things that she did to Protestants. She took their land, she took their businesses away from them. If they were starving, she was like, well, sucks to be you. I guess you should be Catholic. And so people really hated her. She thought that she could like stomp out the Protestant movement. She really thought that she could stomp out this whole idea of an Anglican church. And maybe if she had reigned long enough, she might have been able to do it by killing off enough of the Protestants. But because she reigned for such a short time, she could not. And the reason why she did reign for such a short time is because she got a tumor in her abdomen. She actually thought she was pregnant because her belly got so large, and she called Queen Elizabeth, or her half sister Elizabeth, to come the to the castle, and because she had her locked in the Tower of London for quite some time, and whenever months and months went by, and obviously Queen Mary was not giving birth to a baby, they realized, oh, she has a giant tumor, and she died, and actually died a pretty painful death. So maybe, karma is real after all. We also have, maybe without overstating it at all, probably one of the most significant works in the English language that is written during this time, and that is the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible was, of course, drafted by King James I, the successor to Queen Elizabeth. And his intention was to create a single English translation for the Church of England. We have the scientific issues that are in dispute during this time. All of it we see kind of playing out in Macbeth, because we have this whole theme of illusion versus reality. The other things that are going on in the world during this time is Columbus set sail during this time. We have Martin Luther, who gives people an alternative to Catholicism. We have Galileo, Copernicus, who are challenging the ideas that people have held about the universe, that the world is not flat, how the earth revolves around the sun. Those kinds of scientific ideas are really leaping forward during this time. And all of that is being reflected in the literature that we'll read. Now, the relationship of the writer to tradition. Now, whenever we think of tradition during the Renaissance, we're really talking about the classics of Greek and Roman writers. Now, the views of the ancient Greek and Roman classic writers, they differed from traditional Christians because the Greeks and Romans were pagans. And by this time in England, there are very few pagans remaining. Excuse me. During the Anglo-Saxon period, remember, it's about half and half. By the time we get to the late Anglo-Saxon, early Middle Ages, it's about a quarter of England is still pagan. By the time that we get to the Renaissance, we really have trace amounts of pagans still remaining in England. And the ones that are pagan are often burned at the stake as witches during this time. It didn't just happen in Salem, it happened everywhere, I'm afraid. We do see, though, this rise of humanism, and this based off the writers of the classical era, which is, again, a very human-centered idea. And we see a lot of old things that are becoming new. Classic works that were originally written in Latin began to be translated into English, which is a mind-boggling idea when you consider it's just been, 300 years earlier that people would have chosen instead to write in Latin, but people are translating them now into English. The Iliad, Lives, Aeneid, the Odyssey, all of those are translated during this time for the first time. We also see the rise of iambic pentameter during this time. And we saw that, of course, uh, in Canterbury Tales, but it becomes much more developed by Christopher Marlowe, by William Shakespeare during this Renaissance time period. Now, Elizabethan drama has its origins in the medieval morality plays, um, the medieval time period. Elizabethan drama took from that, and maybe that's part of the reason why the dramatists were looked down on so much. I don't know, but it could be part of the reason. Because those medieval morality plays were really popular, but the people who put them on were usually kind of scummy. So we also have English variations of the sonnet, which are created during this time. Of course, you've learned about the Shakespearean sonnet, but during this unit, we'll also talk about the Spenserian sonnet and the Petrarchan sonnet. All of those are being developed and created during this time. Now, the sonnet is, again, not original to England. It was originally Italian. And we have the King James Bible, which is often referred to KJV version, that is written during this time. Now, to create the King James Version, it was not just like someone who sat down and translated it. King James was so intent that he ended up with like a perfect translation of the Bible that he decided to pull like a whole committee of scholars together, and they translated from the Vulgate, which is in Latin, and the original Greek texts, the Aramaic of the New Testament, and the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And they used all of that to create a new translation. Now, this committee of scholars was massive. And in fact, some believe that Shakespeare might have even helped out on that committee, particularly with the writing of the Psalms, which is pretty fascinating, really. Okay, now a few more things about Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I became queen in 1558. She ruled during a time when nobody thought a woman could succeed as leader. She's often named as England's very greatest monarch. Now, in her reign, there was a very dramatic moment that came in 1588. King Philip of Spain. This is sort of a family quarrel here because remember, Philip of Spain is related to Catherine of Aragon, the woman who was shoved aside for Elizabeth's mama. Okay, so this is all very intertwined. And Elizabeth I, she stood up and she gave a speech, and it is often referred to as the Tilbury speech. And this is a speech, if you were native Britons, you would probably have to memorize part of it, much like how here in the United States, we memorize part of like the Gettysburg Address, or we often read like I Have a Dream. And we know those speeches as Americans because they're pivotal speeches that change the course of American history. This is that kind of speech for Brits. And I have included it on Google Classroom. I want you to go now and go ahead and go watch that video. She's so beautiful and so powerful, and you can see there just how everyone just turns and the tide turns in the battle. Then go ahead and go to page 285 and read the speech before her troops and the very small piece by the Spanish Don Luis de Cordoba, the examination of him. And then I want you to compare the two. Okay. So I'm so glad that you endured this long. I know it's kind of boring to watch these long lectures. So thank you for sticking with me, and sure do miss you guys. Talk to you later.